She was the nurse everyone wanted by their side. Calm, precise, always with a soft tone and a half smile that made even the most tense families feel reassured. Brenda Agüero had built a reputation of professionalism, reliability and compassion inside the neonatal ICU of the Ramon Carrillo Hospital. To parents facing the most vulnerable days of their lives, she was not just a caregiver, she was hope in human form. Colleagues described her as methodical and discreet. She rarely participated in gossip, kept her personal life private, and never raised her voice. Her hands moved with an elegance born from repetition, but her eyes were unreadable, always distant, observant, watching without giving away anything. There were no complaints, no suspicions, no red flags, until one day silence was replaced by questions, one after the other. Fragile lives that were progressing suddenly collapsed without clear explanation. And all the graphs, data, and vital signs had one common factor. Brenda was on duty. But how could that smiling, disciplined woman, someone entrusted with the most sacred task of caring for newborns, possibly be behind so much grief? The shock came not just from the horror of what happened, but from who was at the center of it. A nurse, a woman, a person trained to protect, the kind of person you never imagined capable of hurting those she was supposed to save. And maybe that's why it took so long to see it, because some masks are worn so perfectly for so long that when they finally fall, the silence they leave behind is deafening. Before we go any deeper, make sure you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. This is where we question what hides behind ordinary faces. But sometimes the most unsettling silence isn't the one that follows tragedy. It's the one that was always there, quietly echoing in the background. To grasp the void that seemed to live inside Brenda long before the suspicions, we need to return to where everything truly began. Her origin, her roots, and the invisible marks that may have gone unnoticed. Brenda was the youngest of 3 siblings, and from an early age, she displayed what others described as a serene temperament, never angry, rarely reactive, always composed. But beneath that calm, something else was forming. Her father was distant, not cruel, but emotionally unavailable. He provided for the family, but rarely spoke to his children. Her mother, in contrast, was warm but fragile, often overwhelmed by the demands of the house and emotionally dependent on her children. Brenda, still a child, stepped into the role of quiet caretaker. She learned not to disturb, not to demand, not to cry. This early emotional training became the framework of her identity. At school, she excelled academically, but remained socially invisible. Teachers praised her discipline. Classmates barely remembered her. She seemed to glide through life unnoticed, without drama, without intensity. But the silence was not peace. It was suppression. Years later, when she chose nursing, no one was surprised. Caring for others had always been her role, but what no one saw was how much she internalized. Pain, guilt, expectations, a need to be perfect yet invisible. She never rebelled, never shouted, never said no. She became what others needed, not what she felt, and this is where her story begins to fracture. Her emotional world was not absent. It was tightly controlled, repressed, layered under routines, silence, and a hunger for approval that was never fully satisfied. She didn't harm out of hatred. Her actions, though horrifying, were not explosive. They were systematic, silent, introspective. A shadow formed not from chaos, but from extreme order. In the hospital corridors, Brenda was seen as disciplined, meticulous, and quietly dependable. She worked long shifts, rarely complained, and never attracted attention. Colleagues described her as professional, a word often used when nothing deeper can be said. Patients' families barely noticed her. Supervisors trusted her because she never questioned orders. She became a fixture in the neonatal unit, a constant presence in an environment built on fragility. But fragility has layers. Brenda had been transferring hospitals more frequently than most noticed. A pattern began to emerge. though it remained invisible for too long. Unexplained cardiac arrests, sudden oxygen drops, desperate attempts at resuscitation that always came too late. The symptoms were always the same, the victims always too small to speak. Her calm demeanor never cracked. This is what made it so difficult to see her for what she had become. There were no outbursts, no strange behavior, no confrontation. Just a nurse who always seemed to be in the room when things went wrong and who always left quietly afterward. Psychologically, this was not a woman in chaos. It was someone performing order, masking an internal breakdown with clinical calm. Every death was an emotional reenactment of her own buried despair, enacted not in rage, but in stillness. The hospital became her stage, control was her drug, and the power to decide quietly who lived and who didn't became her secret language. She may have never said it, but her actions whispered a craving to matter, to be seen, to prove that even in silence she could change everything. And she did, one baby at a time. The first internal flags appeared in early 2022. Doctors began to notice that certain neonatal deaths shared peculiar commonalities, timing, symptoms, and medications that didn't align. A silent inquiry started. Data was reviewed. Patterns surfaced. And at the center of these patterns, Brenda Agüero. April 2022, whispers became formal suspicions. The hospital's legal team was notified. Brenda's shifts were discreetly audited. Cross-referencing logs and autopsy reports revealed alarming correlations. The names were different, but the story repeated. Cardiac failure, insulin spikes, and potassium levels that defied explanation. May 2022, the hospital conducted a quiet internal review. No alerts were made public. Brenda kept working, unaware of the shadows growing behind her. Authorities were finally informed when a senior pathologist demanded escalation. June 2022, police surveillance began. Brenda was followed discreetly. Her home was monitored. Search warrants were drafted. The timeline accelerated. July 2022, one final death occurred under Brenda's care. This time, the medical team preserved samples, secured the scene, and refused to let the incident fade. Within 72 hours, Brenda was arrested at her home. Calm, composed. She offered no resistance. August 2022, prosecutors assembled their case. Dozens of documents, hours of surveillance footage, a digital trail of altered logs and erasures. Brenda's computer and phone were seized. Her online search history included terms like neonatal insulin overdose and cardiac arrest signs in infants. October 2022, the case went public. Media outlets picked up the story of the quiet nurse. Court dates were set. Brenda was charged with multiple counts of homicide and medical malpractice. June 2023. After a months-long trial filled with forensic experts, testimony from grieving families, and chilling reconstructions of each incident, Brenda Agüero was convicted on all counts. The verdict was unanimous. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Brenda Agüero's early life was, by most public accounts, ordinary. She was born and raised in Córdoba, Argentina, a city defined by its colonial architecture and modern medical institutions. Her family belonged to the working class. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a receptionist at a local clinic. Nothing in her upbringing screamed trauma. But that's where it becomes complicated. Those who knew her as a child described Brenda as quiet, compliant, always helpful. Teachers remembered her as the type who never caused problems, who smiled at everyone but rarely spoke unless asked. She was invisible, but in a controlled way. Psychologists often point to this kind of behavioral pattern: hyperobedience, lack of emotional expression, avoidance of conflict, as a red flag when it persists into adulthood. Brenda's adult life reflected exactly that. Calm, orderly, meticulous, but not warm, not connected. By the time she entered nursing school, she had already begun to develop an intense attachment to structure and control. Her classmates noted how she never missed a protocol, how she corrected others, quietly, without confrontation. She didn't stand out socially, but she stood out professionally. But control can mask chaos. Experts who later reviewed her case noted how the drive to maintain order can become pathological, especially when paired with emotional detachment and a sense of moral superiority. Brenda saw herself not just as a caregiver, but as a silent judge. It's unclear if she experienced any specific trauma. What is clear is the absence of emotional flexibility. Former friends described her as someone who didn't seem to feel things deeply, who watched tragedy without reacting, and who thought emotions made people weak. There were no prior mental health diagnoses, but forensic psychologists assigned to her case later suggested a possible narcissistic compulsive personality structure where perfection, control, and emotional disconnection override empathy, a defense mechanism born not from violence, but from internal rigidity. During the pretrial psychiatric evaluation, Brenda Agüero underwent a battery of psychological assessments. The results didn't reveal psychosis. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't out of touch with reality. What they revealed instead was something colder, a flat affect, an absence of remorse, and a structured moral reasoning that justified her actions in disturbingly clinical terms. She described her role in the deaths not as acts of violence, but as interventions. Her language, noted by forensic psychiatrists, lacked emotional depth. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She referred to the babies as cases and the deaths as outcomes. This emotional disconnection was central to the diagnosis that followed. Brenda was declared fit to stand trial. But behind that legal capacity was a disturbing psychological picture. She met several criteria for a personality disorder, most notably narcissistic traits, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and a lack of effective empathy. One psychiatrist described her as someone who functioned within rules, but without conscience. In court, Brenda's demeanor remained unchanged. She sat still, calm, impassive. The families of the victims wept as evidence was presented. Autopsies, timestamps, syringe data. Brenda never looked away. Her attorney claimed she had followed procedure. The prosecution painted a different story, of a nurse who played God in silence, confident that no one would suspect her. The case concluded with a unanimous guilty verdict. Brenda Agüero was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, a rare sentence in Argentina reserved for crimes of extreme moral gravity. The judge cited her lack of remorse, the premeditated nature of the injections, and the abuse of her position of trust. No statements of apology were made by Brenda. No family members spoke on her behalf. The final words in the courtroom were left to the judge. This was not just a crime. It was a betrayal of the very essence of care. And the story of Brenda Agüero leaves behind more than grief. It leaves unease, a discomfort that lingers not just because of what she did, but because of how she did it. Not with rage, not with chaos, but with routine, with access, with silence. We often imagine danger wearing a mask of madness, of overt cruelty, but sometimes it wears a badge, it signs charts, it prepares formula, and it waits patiently behind a calm expression. Brenda didn't break the system, she used it. And in doing so, she exposed how vulnerable trust can be when it's taken for granted inside institutions built on care. In the end, what haunted the courtroom wasn't just the evidence. It was the unbearable stillness of her gaze. It was the realization that someone who understood so much about neonatal care could weaponize that knowledge with no outward signs of conflict. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic. For those who watched this video until the end, we invite you to reflect with us. What safety mechanisms failed? What warning signs were ignored? And how many others might still walk hospital corridors, hidden in plain sight? If this story moved you, or made you question what lies beneath the surface of ordinary roles, consider supporting the work we do here at Criminal Psychology Unmasked. Leave a comment below. Your thoughts matter more than you know. Like the video if you believe these stories need to be told. And if you're not yet subscribed, now is the moment to join our growing community. We dive deep, we ask the difficult questions, and we expose what others leave in the dark. And this is far from over. The next case we're preparing reveals another disturbing layer of the human mind, in a context that will once again challenge everything we think we know. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and we'll meet again in the next video.